not want to speak. And Maria, what we would like to do is if you have any comments, to go make the comments now. And then if you have questions, you can see Marty or send them into the commission. Because we're not sure what the questions would be and if we'd be prepared to answer them or not.
Well, maybe I should close them first then?
Yeah, we don't want to, yeah, you can get up, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So if you want to do that now?
Yeah, but announcements.
Oh, that was, oh yeah, announcements first.
Right.
Okay, so Maria, you're up.
All right. Do you just want me to sit?
Go right up here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that way
To the
everybody.
podium?
Yeah, go to the podium
Okay.
because Grant can buy a go-to meeting and that
Okay.
way with the, he can hear you through the microphone.
Oh, my. I wasn't really prepared for this formal speaking gig here, but firstly, yeah, thank you for presenting the PFAS plan. That's what I'm going to ask about. Because it was only posted, I think, a day before yesterday, and I had a really, really busy day yesterday. I had about 3 minutes to look through it last night while exhausted. So I just have a few questions that I hope maybe Marty or maybe the communications person can answer. On the plan itself, again, by frantically going through it, I guess I had a difficult time understanding the timing of the phased approach. So I'm assuming Marty will address that. It looks to me like the first round of testing, I would characterize PFAS at the Nine Springs plant and the influent effluent biosolids, struvite, and polymers. And then an optional additional sampling would, if necessary, would further characterize initial sample points, determine high concentration and transformation points within the plant's processes, and investigate potential industrial sources in the district service area. I guess I'd like to know the timing of both the initial sampling and then the optional sampling and what that would be based on. I guess I'm a little concerned that investigating potential sources is kind of optional and next. And then it looks to me like there's another phase that might or might not happen later that would include testing air, testing Badfish Creek, fish and sediments, a whole list of other things. And I'm concerned that those things that seem really critical to me are being pushed out to some unknown time. So that's a concern I have on the timing. And then on the communications plan, I guess, again, looking through it very, very quickly, I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about Amanda and her background. A lot of the talking points here seem to me very much reflecting what I've seen in kind of corporate risk downplaying. And so they all look like points to make people less concerned about the potential risks of PFAS on biosolids in farmland. And I guess I'm a little concerned about already making those points before you have any data. So I guess I'd like to just learn more about that approach and where it comes from. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that takes us to Marty is up on the PFAS sampling and analysis.
All right, good morning, commissioners.
Good morning, Marty.
Morning, Marty.
So today I'm going to give a little overview of the results of our consultant PFAS plan and talk a little bit about the timing. So Maria, I think we'll be able to answer most of your questions on that with this presentation. So before we get deep into it, I just wanted a quick refresher of the specific focus that we're looking at here. So this is the specific focus of the wastewater role in the larger PFAS cycle. And so our knowledge is still evolving. And you can see here that we are still in the middle of the cycle, so we're part of the cycle, but we have a different challenges in other pieces of the cycle. And so the more we really focus in on our piece here in the middle, in knowing the pathways that happen within this gray box, we'll better understand those black arrows that come out to the outside of the circle and better figure out how we can affect our part and how that affects the other parts. So we really do have to start with understanding deeply our particular knowledge in the gray circle. and that will in turn help us figure out how closely we play our role for the other parts of the cycle that we definitely have an interest in. So that's the focus of the sampling. So the sampling isn't going to happen in a vacuum. It's part of a larger action plan. And so right now we're in the consultant phase, but we also have our industrial customer phase that relies on pollution prevention and source reduction, as well as looking at regulatory options related to our sewer use ordinance. So we're not going to go into those today, but there'll be other opportunities that we're going to come to the commission to talk about those other parts of the action plan as we get into those. But we had to begin with our consultant study to really deeply understand what's going on specifically at our plant, so we can then further take out those other actions. So to gain a better understanding, our sampling plan is coupled with a few other pieces of information, because as a whole, it constitutes pretty much the study that we're talking about in that gray box I mentioned in the first slide. And so all pieces of it include a sampling and analysis plan, which I'm going to refer to as sampling analysis that I talked about a little bit. We also have a fate and transport information, because it's one thing to understand the levels and amounts, but you have to also understand how it moves and may change with those levels and amounts. So understanding the fate and transport is important to know when you're actually taking samples. And then we also have a site model that visualizes that fate and transport. So as we learn more information, as we sample and get more detail, we can then begin to fine tune that model and figure out where we can better make actions. So I'll just give a little bit of information overview on the sampling and analysis plan and really what the focus was. And so in a nutshell, it really was meant to lead the department in making the right decisions regarding how to sample, where to sample, to make sure we have defensible results. When we talk about PFAS measurements, we're talking about very low concentrations, and so to have ultimate trust and confidence in the results is very important. And so along with that, the plan really does overview the latest published information regarding analytical methodologies and screening techniques. It's really important for the district to be up to speed as to what those are, because we're not going to be able to do that ourselves. We're going to be relying on a third party. So in order for us to verify and make sure that what we're asking for is correct and what we're going to receive is what we're looking for, making sure that we have the latest information on what is actually happening out there when it regards to PFAS analysis is important. So we're sort of beefing up our base of knowledge so we can further be successful. And then the plan also outlines the recommended sampling for each type of media. So at the wastewater treatment plant, we don't just test our wastewater, but we also have biosolids as well. So those are different types of media, one's more solid, one's more liquid. And so the plan also talks about the different analysis and how we deal with those different media that we have here at the plant. And then lastly, the plan also goes into, how do you sample once you get information? So when you sample, you just don't get one result. You're going to have a result that you interpret, analyze, and figure out what does this mean for what we either take an action or need further information to understand what we have. So the plan also outlines a path to do that as well. So that path is going to be basically a phased approach. And the first recommendation is to sample our influent. And we have 5 different influent streams coming into the plant. So that would actually be 5 different samples. We have 5 different pumping stations that contribute. But we also have pumping stations that contribute to those pumping stations. So in a second phase, we can further investigate how that comes into play. But in the first phase, we're going to focus on the influent. We're also going to focus on our effluent. We also have 2 effluent streams, but the effluent's the same, so we're not going to require 2 different effluent samples. We also going to sample our biosolids. And our biosolids currently involve our liquid Metrogrow, but we also have our Class AK. So those are 2 different types of biosolids we have. 2 other sort of outputs of the plant that was recommended to be in the initial phase of sampling. Our outputs that we understand was leaving the plant is our struvite material, and also the inputs we put into our plant processes are getting polymers. So the first phase of sampling is going to focus on the influent, effluent, our biosolids, struvite, and our polymers. And the idea behind using a phased approach is that since we haven't sampled at all for these compounds, getting that base knowledge of what actually is there will give us information if we want to take additional sampling. For instance, if we sample our influence and we have 5 different influence samples from 5 different pumping stations, and we get drastically different results between those 2 different 5 samples. That would be an indication that we need to learn more about what's happening there. And so the next phase would then to basically further characterize those influence samples. For instance, we may be looking at additional PFAS compounds or tracing back up in the collection system. So that's an example of an initial sample and then a second approach based on the results of the first. Another important piece of this is if we get information about what's happening within the plant. So you can see here that we sort of diagrammed out. These are up here for you to read. This is up here for you to understand all the different places where we need to understand what happens with PFAS. So basically, if you just focus on colors and you see all the orange colors, those are all different sampling points that could be added in for additional sampling. So for instance, if we were sampling our influent, and then we also sample our effluent, and we get really different numbers, like what is going on. That means we have to really dig deep inside the treatment plant processes and understand where those numbers may be changing. And that's pretty important information to have, because if we know how PFAS transforms within our plant processes, then we can start to pinpoint potential actions we could take to alleviate that and maybe decrease the amount of PFAS being in our effluent. So you can see that, you know, on the far left, orange is the beginning of our process, so we start out there, and then the far right is going to be the end of our process, and we end there. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the middle, so additional sampling would be able to pinpoint different processes and get that information. So that's sort of the idea behind a phased approach to testing. You do an initial to understand what's going on, to see if you need more. Maybe you don't. We really don't know what the results you're going to see. So instead of just going full bore right into lots and lots of samples where you may not need them. The other part of the study that sort of goes along with this is that fate and transport and that conceptual model I talked about. And I kind of alluded to how you can use the sample results along with the model of how things move around. So this is just, here's a visual representation of sort of the nine streams plant in the middle there, and all the places that either input to the plant or that we touch from things leaving the plant. And so to know this bigger picture cycling is important, because as we get information, as I showed in the previous slide, of what's happening within our plant, then we can begin to understand how we affect the outside environment. So we really just want to use this to identify where potential data gaps could be and where we could potentially sample to alleviate those gaps. And the report in the fate and transport part does outline data gaps specific to our plant processes as well as potential environmental data gaps. So I think we're ready to get a question about the additional sampling that referred to environmental sampling. That's an unknown timeline because we really don't know what our sample results are. If we get sample results, for instance, in our biocells that may cause us concern about this particular model of the cycle that shows our biocells go into the outside environment, then we could potentially sample to fill those data gaps of exactly what happens out there. But we just don't quite know if we're going to do that yet. But the plan outlines how to do that if we choose to take that route. The other thing I want to point out about the coupling between fate and transport and sampling is the polymer example, and basically how we don't know until we figure it out. So the polymer is listed as an initial sample point for initial characterization. But we also show that in our plant processes, polymer comes in at multiple phases in the process. It's not just one place, it's 3 different places. So if you don't know the fate and transport of how things move, you're not going to know that you need to sample and test polymer in 3 different places. So the knowledge gap we have is, does polymer contain PFAS? We don't know. Where does polymer get inserted? Fate and transport tells us that. how much PFAS is in the polymer, the sampling tells us that. So that's sort of how they sort of go together, the movement, the transformation, as well as the data results. Another example of this is also sort of like affluent. We talked about biosolids being a concern, and we know that in the literature and in the review, it talks about different chain PFAS partitioning and moving into water, or different chain PFAS moving into solids. And so the only way we can understand how the PFAS moves is through that conceptual model. So that tells us where different PFAS would be. But we don't know which PFAS are where. So because the model tells us particular chain PFAS may move in different places, then when we sample, we can make sure we focus on looking for those particular PFAS, so we really can understand if what the literature is telling us is true for our particular processes. So for example, the short chain that likes to go to water, we would expect in our biosolids to see long chain PFAS. That would be our expectation. The question is, does that mean biosolids are safe on our farm fields? Well, we know that long chain PFAS are not as likely to be taken up by the whole plant as opposed to short chain PFAS. So at first, it may look like, well, long chain PFAS in biosolids, less risk because it isn't taken up by plants, we should be okay. But we don't know what the chain PFAS is in our biosolids yet. So until we get that information, we don't know if we have to go further to figure out if the long chain and short chain actually in the soil is being taken up by the plants. If we see there's a concern, yes, we can take that additional step. So that's sort of how the phase and transport sampling together gives us the options for phased approach and how we approach things. So you all should be familiar with this slide. I showed it last time we talked, and this is our timeline. So how long is it going to take to do all the stuff we talked about? Well, we're still on a good place right now. It's still February, and we have a plan that we're hoping that you guys approve. And then we'll be in a good position to put out an RFP to actually get someone in here to sample and send to a certified lab. We expect that to happen in March, and with our procurement process, that should be lining up pretty well. The one wild card in all this is still the availability of certified laboratories. Our last contact with DNR was actually yesterday, and we discovered that this DNR is still on track to have certified laboratories in March. They don't give us an exact date, but the status is that there are 4 particular labs that have already undergone an audit, which means that they indicated their intention to become certified. They had DNR come to their lab, show them that they meet the method, and now DNR is writing a report to see if they actually passed the audit. Typically, you get the report, you have a deficiency, you correct it, you are then certified. So we're at the phase now where these 4 labs are waiting for their report back from DNR. That should happen within the next 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, I should say. And at that point, they should be certified. So things seem to be lining up with timeline to have certified labs to send our samples to and to get a consultant on board. Once we collect the samples and send them to the lab, there's another unknown with timing. We can request in our request for proposal that we choose a lab that offers expedited service. We typically do that. It's usually not that much more expensive, but that still doesn't mean you get your results in one day. So typical lab results for PFAS, when you're looking at multiple compounds, multiple blanks, multiple analysis, is typically in the order of 4 weeks. Expedited can get you a little shorter than that, so you kind of build in a little bit of wiggle room. So from the day we send the sample to the lab, we think it could be maybe up to a 4-week turnaround time, which would put us to be actually getting our first initial results in that April timeframe if we get the samples to the labs in March. So that's the timeline we're working on. It's reflected up here, so I don't think any changes need to be made yet. But as I said, there are 2 pieces in that timeline that we have no control over, but as we continue to track those, at this moment in time, they seem to be on track. So with that, we'll finish up and just ask for the recommendation that you approve the resolution that basically recommends that we use this phased approach, use the initial sampling for those 5 areas I talked about, allow us to analyze and then continue additional sampling as needed. And that's all the stuff for questions. Thank you.
Okay, anybody have any questions, Commissioner?
I do, and I'm not sure. I have a well, I have a technical question about the sample plan. And I also was wondering about the laboratory turnaround times, Marty, and you answered that. Because it seems like this is such a big issue right now, and there's appears to be a limited number of laboratories, and I was wondering about the bottleneck, if that was a concern.
If I could just maybe, so I think the labs also realize that, and some anecdotal evidence that we got from the certification folks was that some of these labs are actually hiring more people in anticipation of higher volume, so it could be better.
My technical question really is, in reading the sampling plan, there's 36 PFAS, specific PFAS compounds that are listed for analysis out of 4,000, give or take, PFAS compounds that are out there. And I'm wondering if those 36 represent the variation in chain length and other properties that would affect the fate transport of the PFAS in the plant. So, I mean, if you were catching representatives of different types of compounds, then that would be more helpful in then modeling other fate transport, making us being able to extrapolate the results of the testing better. Do you know if it's well represented, that as it, those 36 compounds represent the group as a whole?
So I'm actually not going to be able to answer that question in terms of is the chemistry diverse on that list. The list of 36 came from the Wisconsin 36 compounds that DNR and DHS are currently evaluating. So they call it Wisconsin 36. So that's what we focused on for our particular state, but I cannot give you an answer if they're chemically diverse. Looking at the list just visually, if I were to guess, I would say I think most are represented, but in terms of there's only 1 6 chain and 12 4 chain or whatever, I can't answer that question.
Anything else? Okay, I had a couple questions. So the state hygiene lab was not one of the labs because they would only do 31 compounds, is that what I read?
I think that was the past.
Oh, okay.
So they've been sampling and analyzing PFAS for quite some time, so they've already can do up to 31. Other labs we don't really know yet.
Okay.
Tell us they will be seeking certification for 36.
Okay, they would, okay, that was for, I remember seeing the 31 in the report. And then, so we don't have a standard as of yet for PFAS levels in biosolids or in wastewater or anything like that, correct? So we're doing the sampling before we have a standard that's been set by DNR, and we're using kind of the lower drinking water standard.
That's correct. There's no regulatory standard for PFAS levels in biosolids. There's no regulatory standard for a discharge limit in the WPS permit. There are health limits of standards for drinking water. That's as much as I can say that.
Okay, and then my last question, you partially answered by you didn't know whether or not the polymers contain PFAS, but my other question is, we probably don't know this either, but is there any chance that we have anything else within the system that may have PFAS? I think of coatings, we have coatings on, the digesters and things like that, and that we redo some, every now and then. So I don't know if that's a concern, or if you think that that map that you showed of the district where you plan to sample would maybe catch any of that type of possibility.
I knew someone was going to bring that up. So what you described is accurate. We do not know from the physical standpoint the materials that we use 100% what contains PFAS and what doesn't. The sampling plan doesn't necessarily going to be able to pinpoint is this coating or that coating. What it will do is give us levels that we can say in the source reduction setting, pollution prevention setting, are we doing a good job? as we learn more about product substitutions and materials that contain PFAS, we can use that knowledge to look internally at ourselves to potentially see where low-hanging fruit would be. When you're talking about these low levels, and we have such a large volume of material coming through our plant, chances are those types of things may not be a high contributor, although I can't say that with certainty unless we actually do a sampling method that would drill down to that. So I would say, in a nutshell, if we continue to have questions about the levels in our data and doing source prevention, that things aren't going down, we really can't figure out what's going on, then you begin to look at potential internal physical things that you're inputting that you may not be aware of.
I want to add to what Marty's saying is early in this presentation, as we test influent and effluent, and there's that delta.
Right.
And if we find there's more coming out than going in, then that would motivate us to start to look throughout our entire process, trying to figure out the original source.
Well, that's what I was getting to, because you had that map of the plant that showed all those different sampling points, and so that answers the question. Mary?
I'm just wondering about the polymer. I don't understand, like, is that a raw material that you purchase and then add to the process, or?
Yes. I'm not an expert at that, but yes to that.
So would you not be able to find out the composition of that polymer at the point that you bring it on site
Yes.
from the supplier?
So, yes, so the supplier gives us SDS sheets, and should we know what's in the polymer, that should be pretty easy. Yes, in a perfect world, that would be exactly how we do it. We could just look it up and know. Typically, some things can be listed in SDSs, as you know, as proprietary things. You don't get the information, and also percentages, either by volume or weight. If it's under a certain percentage of the actual formulation, you have to report an SDS. So when we're dealing with really low levels of a compound, SDS isn't really necessarily something to rely on.
I kind of look at it like peanut allergies. That you have plants that you may have cleaned all your equipment, but if the plant had done something with peanuts, and you were processing almonds, there still may be something around that a peanut that gets into the almond mix, and so therefore people are very sensitive to peanut allergies. I guess my point is that you may, even if you know what's in the polymers, you don't know what the manufacturing process that they go through to produce the polymers, if there's any PFAS in their chain of manufacturing that might wear off in coating or anything like that. So. Okay, any other questions? Grant, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do, thank you. Overall, just wanted to say, I think the plan looks really good, so I really appreciate all the work that went in there. It seems like a very good strategy. Two questions. One, because the certified lab, such a new thing, and the testing methodology, all that, I don't know what the cost would be, but is there any value in considering sending samples to more than one lab, just to sort of confirm that there aren't some issues with these newly certified labs?
It's a great question. There is always value in having two concurrent labs and two different analysis for comparison, especially at the beginning of the sampling. So I like that suggestion. Of course, that would clearly add cost, but I think in this situation, it's a great idea. And something we have done in the past for other things, so it's not unprecedented.
Great. And then the second question is kind of looking at that timeline graph that you had up there. Maybe this would already happen, it's just not called out, but I think it would be helpful once we could get the results back, just to bring those back to the commission. Obviously, there's going to take a fair amount of time to do the analysis and to come up with sort of recommended next steps, but I would say just in terms of public transparency, et cetera, I think it'd be helpful to just bring those results back, whenever they're available, and then, coming again later with here's our analysis, here's our action plan.
Just clarification, Commissioner Foster, on that, you're saying when we get the results back, bring them to the commission and then come back to the commission again once we complete the analysis of what the results potentially mean or potential actions based on those? So 2 touches?
Yep, correct. So more just really I mean, maybe even putting a kind of inflection point on that timeline, but basically once the results are received, share those out. Again, I don't think we would expect you to be able to answer a lot of questions about what does this mean, but I think, again, it's really valuable to be transparent and put those out there and say, here's the results we got. We are, analyzing them. We'll be back in a month, 2 months, whatever that time frame is, with, recommendations for further sampling, et cetera.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? I guess Grant had the one suggestion of go send them to 2 labs. So that would double the cost if we did it for all of the samples, or would you just do it for some to see if there's consistency or not consistency? Or do you do it all?
We do them all because of the different media.
Okay.
We have to do them all.
Yeah. Mary?
The question about would we send samples to 2 labs, it made me wonder about, in a more general quality assurance plan for the analysis. And I don't recall seeing that in the TRC report. Is there, is there a plan to systematically evaluate the quality of the data, duplicates, different specs for the analytical methods? Just is there, what is the quality assurance plan?
So I believe in the sampling plan, when it lists the sampling points and what's needed, it does list duplicates and blanks in terms of accuracy. But in terms of, when we look at the data or what the lab's performance is, we rely on the lab certification for their QA/QC and their internal processes and the notes they tell us. So the only QA/QC we can do would be what Commissioner Foster recommends is have two labs do it, and then we can compare results and consistent differences, and then we can dig deeper into why that would be. Because we're not doing the analysis ourselves. I guess, am I misunderstanding your question?
No, I think way back when I worked in Superfund, remedial investigations and did data validation, and I'm familiar with quality assurance plans for sampling and analysis, and that's probably like way more than people, than you want to undertake. But there are things that you can look at in terms of the reports from the laboratories to see if their particular analysis was, meeting the control specs at the time. Are there any issues? How do the duplicates look? How do the blanks look? And interpreting that information, or having somebody knowledgeable interpreting that information to see if, the results that you're getting are good results. And sometimes it's just a matter of documenting what your parameters are, what your criteria are, to say, yes, this is good data.
Well, it might be a good question for the DNR as a certifier of the labs to see if they do follow through with the labs as to their quality assurance and quality control methods, right? Because I don't know that it's, I had that kind of same question on my notes here, but then I thought, well, maybe we need more a question for the DNR who certifies the labs. So maybe that's a good question to pose back to them.
Before we just go back to Commissioner Swanson, your comment. So now I understand a little bit, I think, of the explanation. So that's stuff we do on our end as part of our analysis. And I think, yes, we're making sure we're also familiar with the methods of analysis. So our lab manager and our breaching coordinator is going to be able to look at the data and interpret it, make sure for every side. I think, yes, we will have that expertise to be able to look at those things in the report and understand that. Go back to the certified side. Yeah, this question can ask DNR, but I mean, they have a strict process for certification, so you can make some assumptions on, does the lab have in place proper QAQC in the way they do things? Yes, because they're certified.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, if we approve the plan, the next step will be to send out RFPs to the sampling, to the 4 or so sampling agencies, take the samples, or get that results back, or select the consultant or provider, and then do the samples, and then late April, May, have the samples back, and then go from there, depending on what the samples say. Is that kind of a nutshell?
Yes.
Yep.
Hopefully not.
Excuse me. So, we have the PFAS sampling and analysis plan. Do we have a motion to approve resolution 2020-02-13R5?
So moved. Sorry.
I would move approval with the recommendation to send the samples to multiple labs initially.
Okay,
I agree with that.
so we have a motion by Commissioner Foster, second by Commissioner Meyer. There are two going on at the same time. To recommend approval of the resolution, subject to the fact that we send samples to 2 different laboratories. Okay, any further questions?
Quick question. I think I saw the analysis by the lab is going to cost $40,000. Is that right, Marty? Just start pinning down what that number is and we're building it. So what is it 34 go to?
For the initial sampling, that's correct.
That first round would be, so it'd be closer to 80,000 under this proposal.
Hard to exactly say because, you know, there is, the more samples you give, you can get a deal, you know, stuff like that. So I don't know if I would completely say it was going to double, but it'll be more.
It sounds like our direction is to
Yeah.
go as far as doubling it if that's what it takes to get replicas of the samples like that. Okay, thanks.
Okay, anything else? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the resolution as,
Sorry.
oh, I'm sorry.
I don't know that I necessarily agree with just the plan of sending the samples to 2 laboratories. I would prefer to broaden that to have something that more directly addresses quality assurance, whether that be a subset of the samples going to 2 laboratories or other ways of assuring the quality of data. One of my concerns is that if you send it to 2 laboratories and you get 2 different results, what do you do with that information? Do you just average them?
Send it to a 3rd.
You know, so you need to know what you're going to do with that information and how many samples to send to 2 laboratories. So I would, I don't know, amend Grant's suggestion to have it be more, to include along with the sampling and analysis plan a more transparent plan to assure the quality of the data.
So, do you wish to still do the 2 samples, but then also say a transparent plan to assure the quality of the data? Or do
I'm saying
one
that
sample?
duplicate analyses might be part of the plan, but I'm saying instead of just saying send it to 2 laboratories, send all the samples to 2 laboratories, instead of that, to say the sampling and analysis plan should be augmented with a more transparent explanation of quality assurance.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying. I'm just trying, I think we need a motion to amend the original motion, which has to do the 2 sampling. The way, excuse me, the way I understand your motion is that you want a transparent quality assurance plan, and that may or may not include sampling 2 different laboratories to do the analysis.
Or it would define how many samples to send to 2 laboratories. All of them, some of them, you know.
Right, so it may be all, part, or none, depending on how they view the quality assurance within the lab. Okay. So do we have a motion? Do you want to make that motion to amend the original motion?
Yes.
Okay, so motion by Commissioner Swanson to amend the original motion to say and remove the two different sampling and just instead say that there be a transparent quality assurance plan established prior to sampling. And that would come back here.
Yes.
Okay, so that might delay the process. So that's, okay, everybody understand the amendment?
Do we have time to accomplish that and still stay on the timeline that Marty presented?
Can I get a second to the motion first before we get?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion by Commissioner Swanson, seconded by Commissioner Murphy, and that was to do a quality assurance plan prior to, that would come back to the commission for approval prior to undertaking the sampling, and that quality assurance plan may or may not have double analysis of all or part of the samples. So now, Brad had a good question. Marty, do you know how long if it would delay, how long it would delay to get this quality assurance plan? Because that's at least 2 weeks, right? Because it would come back to the commission?
Well, if I'm envisioning what I'm envisioning, this really is just going to be writing down what we already do when we get lab results from other labs, because we do this already. So I don't anticipate taking very long if that is what the product is. If it's something more that I'm maybe not quite understanding, I need more clarification, but it was that we get, for instance, mercury, very low level, we can't do all the low level mercury, we send it out. We get mercury results back. That's for our permits. So when we get them back, we have people that make sure that those are accurate data. So we'll be writing down that process. That won't take very long.
And one question before, does your selection of a consultant kind of include the one to do the sampling? Does that include how they, an analysis of, have our lab managers look at how they do the samples to make sure that they on their end have the proper quality control, or are you assuming because they're certified they have that?
If you're asking about the lab that
Yeah.
we're sending it to,
Right.
because they're certified, they have it. If you're talking about the people conducting the sampling, they will be providing to us what they plan to do, and we will QA/QC that before we select somebody.
Okay. Does that make sense?
I wanted to ask Marty to clarify too, when you write down our process, would that also include what our lab's recommendation is for duplicate sampling? Because I think what Commissioner Swanson is saying, are we going to 2 labs for everything, or are we going to hone in on just a few critical samples? And will that writing down the process answer that question?
Well, I heard that the process may or may not need to include that, so I don't think I was going to give specific direction as to analyzing if that particular ask needs to be done. I was going to have the process be documented, the typical process. If that does include duplicate, then it does. It may say something like, if we look at the results and we see X, Y, and Z, we recommend going and getting a second sample. So that's how it manifests itself.
Okay, so does everybody understand the amendment to the original motion? Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, Grant?
Yeah, thanks. Just one, again, to get confirmation, assuming that could come back then in 2 weeks, it shouldn't affect the overall timeline, so confirmation on that. And then secondly, I guess just in the point of, will that recommendation anticipate saying, well, now we have some question about, what's about the results from that lab, that would then seems likely say, well, maybe we should now send out to another lab. And just in terms of skipping that process, or or just getting some additional confidence in what we do get back on the first round, it feels to me like incorporating use of more than one lab, again, just because of the newness of all these things and new certifications, et cetera, still really feels like a wise decision. So, be happy to see what the recommendation is when it comes back. I just wanted to share that it doesn't feel like doing it because we think there's value in it. I'd rather do it up front and not sort of extend the full timeline of the overall process and wait to get a result back and then wonder, should we have, or now maybe we should send to another lab. So more of a comment, I guess, on that.
Okay, so any other, thank you, Grant. So the motion is to come back potentially within 2 weeks with a transparent quality assurance plan. And that quality assurance plan will be developed mainly in-house by our lab, and that will include whether or not to go to a second analysis on all or part of the samples. I think everybody understand that? I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so let's vote on the amendment to the original motion. So all those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Motion carries. Let's vote on the motion now as amended to approve the resolution with a transparent quality assurance plan. All those in favor of the resolution with that caveat or addition, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Motion carried. Okay, we got through that. Thank you.
Hey, Tom, can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
Before you leave the matter? I think Mary would be willing to look at it if you want to run it by her. I mean, it might
I'll
help.
look at it, but I don't know that that would be appropriate.
Well, it would definitely be appropriate.
Yeah.
Because I think it's your concern about some specific things, and I think it might be helpful if you don't mind.
The manager should come to the next meeting to provide what they need.
Well, I think what Commissioner Wilson is saying, we'll share a draft with Mary prior to it coming to the meeting. Does that work?
Yeah,
I
that's
think it's
fine.
way
That's fine. Okay, that takes us to the pfas, I guess, communication plan. Amanda?
So good morning, I'm Amanda. So I am here to present our PFAS communications plan, but because I am a newer face here at the district, I just want to kind of recap where I came from. So I spent a couple years at the state, at the Economic Development Department, but before that, I was with Clean Wisconsin for 8 years as their communications and marketing director. So these sort of things are not new to me at all. So before we dig into the communications plan, so at our November 27th meeting, Marty had presented a 3-pronged plan. He just went over the sampling analysis, also indicated that another prong of that was waiting for the state certified labs, and then the third piece, my piece, is the communications plan. Before we dig in, though, I just want to make sure we're kind of all viewing this from the same lens. As we all know, this issue is ever evolving. What we know today will be different tomorrow, will be different the next day. And this plan, with that in mind, is not chiseled in stone. And the messages and the tactics that you see here today, they are intended to be adaptable and flexible as we learn more. And whether that's for the better or for the worse. So we will definitely need to be changing this as we go along, and I'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end. So with that, let me give you the nuts and the bolts. So, first of all, the plan lays out kind of the objectives. So 3 points there: codifying the messages, outlining the tactics that we're going to use to both engage and educate our audiences, and then to set a process for sharing our own sampling results. So one of the things we have heard very loud and clear every time we talk about PFAS, and there's no question about it, is the need for transparency. So we built that into this plan. And how we approach this issue and the communications around it can either build a public trust or erode it. And so that's kind of really where these plan objectives came from. Again, as I said, we're very much committed to transparency, and I said with the last slide, you know, there are things we know and there are things that we don't know. And we're, you know, to be flexible, we will be accommodating for all of this. The plan also identifies our audiences. So the 3 that you see up there are the 3 primary audiences that we are looking to educate and engage with on this. So our customer communities and the general public, our MetroGrow customers, and then as well as the media. So there is still a lot of outreach that needs to be done, a lot of education that needs to be done around this issue, which is very complex and again, ever changing. So we really wanted to be broad in our audiences as we planned out these tactics. The approach that I took with messaging for the communications plan is called a message mapping approach. So a message map is basically a roadmap that displays in a detailed hierarchical way responses to anticipated questions or concerns. This is kind of just a visual of how falls out, but you can see them in the plan as well. Message maps are a very important tool for risk communications. They help ensure that risk information has a good chance of being heard, and that we're being clear in what we know and what we don't know. And I had said, you know, a few slides back, to view this through a lens of flexibility and adaptability. So in that spirit, the messages outlined in the plan are a snapshot that are based in time of what we know today. They are not a policy position that we will continue to advocate. As we get information, as we get sampling analysis back, as that validated science and research continues to evolve, we will evolve as well. We also know that we will need to address additional questions and concerns. And so these message maps account for that. Some may go away, we may add some. In terms of tactics, there are a variety of them in the plan, and they kind of fall into these 3 categories that we call push, pull, and interactive. Taking that a little bit from marketing and from project management. So a push communication is basically a message that we send out. It's intended to be received by someone else. It's a broadcast message. A pull is basically something that is out there that is more informational that people can go get themselves. And then interactive is pretty self-explanatory, but it's a means for sharing that information and intelligence in more of a real-time discussion. So, while today is pretty much the unofficial kickoff into the plan, just know that we have not waited to start moving forward on this plan. For instance, one tactic that we're using is informational sessions with our MetroGrow customers. And in these sessions, they're going to be informational about the program as a whole, but we are including information on PFAS, so what we know and what we don't know. That is a question that we get from, or that Kim in our MetroGrow program has indicated that she gets questions on a lot. So providing some education in terms of what the district is doing, what we know, what we don't know. So we've actually already set up those meetings. There's 2 meetings that were set up in the town of Bristol and the town of Dunkirk in the first half of March. And those 2 townships kind of represent where the bulk of the fields are, and gives our farmers and landowners options in terms of where they can go. Of course, communicating about PFAS does not come without its challenges because it is so dynamic. A couple of the challenges: legislative action, things are constantly changing. We'll need to adapt to that. The pace of agency action. Obviously, we continue to learn more about PFAS every day. And then there's also how the media approaches this issue. There's a lot. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to understand. And so helping better communicate about PFAS is a challenge. But of those that I listed, perhaps the most significant in communicating about PFAS is the pace of agency action, which has left a void in risk communications, which is really important of things such as this. So emerging contaminants, emergencies, natural disasters, things like that. So risk communications, if you're not familiar with it, is a valuable tool when dealing with these concerns. And it helps to disseminate information quickly. It helps to build understanding. It helps define levels of risk. It helps assist in allaying fears and uncertainties. And it really provides validation. So instead of one agency saying one thing and another saying another, there becomes the cohesiveness comes together with risk communications. Usually risk communications best come from public agencies, natural resource protection, emergency management. Unfortunately right now, the DNR is still, and the other state agencies are still trying to get their plan together. Marty and I just were at the Wisconsin PFAS Action Council, WISPAC, municipal meeting yesterday. They have a 4-point plan. One of them is, in fact, risk communications. They're just not there yet. So because the district is really kind of setting the pace for this issue, we will have to take on some of that risk communication ourselves. That certainly does put us in a position where we may need to say, we have to provide the backstop for that with the risk communications. That's not to say that state agencies aren't coming along. We're all running the same race. We just might not be on the same track. So risk communications is a piece of this plan, but at the same time, just that knowing that puts us in a unique position to kind of be out ahead of the game. And I've said it a couple times, but again, this plan is meant to be adaptable and meant to be flexible. The messages will change, the tactics will change, the communication priorities will shift, the messages will morph. And we will certainly be keeping the commission abreast of that. Within the plan is essentially an outline of how we will keep the commission updated on this. That includes me coming back to you on a quarterly basis, both to update you on what we're doing and what we're hearing, but also on what you are hearing out in your communities, so we can adjust for that. So you get to see me again in May. And I think that takes us to the end.
Okay.
What questions do you have?
Any questions? Grant, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. And I think that was a good presentation. And you mentioned the WISPAC meeting. Obviously, you heard my fair comment there around communications. I'll just share it here for the benefit of the commission. I think especially reflecting on communications that came from the water utility, related to this issue around well heating, et cetera. One thing I would just really like to see us do is to stop short of trying to communicate message to not worry to the public. I think even when very well intended, I've seen that have a really negative impact on communities, and so I think absolutely sharing everything we know, everything we don't know, what we're doing, et cetera, why we're not taking certain actions, I think is a frequently asked question that I get from residents that's helpful to kind of proactively answer. Just really being thoughtful about not trying to sort of be persuasive and trying to communicate that, these levels are very low, you have nothing to worry about. I think it just often backfires. So I know you heard that from me yesterday, but I just wanted to put that out there for the group.
Thank you, Commissioner Foster. I did hear that yesterday, and I did appreciate that comment.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. I don't think there was any action required.
There's no action on this, it's just informational.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh, Mary.
Just that, I just wanted to comment that I agree with Grant's comments about the messaging and not to, too much trying to just reassure people, but be more objective.
Okay. I think she understands that. Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you, Marty. That was okay. Vanessa.
Good morning. So I'm presenting the legal regulatory update. As Amanda mentioned, there's been a lot going on in the legislature regarding PFAS. So I'm jumping around here a little on the regulatory review we provided, but one of the bills that has been signed into law is the prohibition on firefighting foam that was published February 6, 2020. And then we have a couple of other, there's some somewhat inactive bills still pending in the legislature, but we've seen a lot of movement on two new bills. Last week there were hearings on SB 772, AB 843, which is a bipartisan alternative to a bill that had been previously introduced by the Democratic senators earlier in 2019. This bill would require DNR to promulgate emergency rules for groundwater standards for PFOS and PFOA. Not surface or drinking water standards though, those would progress through the normal rulemaking process that I'll mention later, that DNR is already engaging in. And then there were some elements to that bill. It established a municipal grant program for dealing with PFAS contamination, but we had some concerns about the limitations on that grant program. Marty was at the hearing and presented some testimony about that and about the proof of financial responsibility that DNR could require if for anyone accepting PFAS containing products. And we were concerned about the potential for the potential application to landowners accepting biosolids. So there's been some movement on an amendment to that bill that would, I think, provide a broader reach for the municipal grant program. The main concern there was that it limited it to application of biosolids that had occurred prior to the published date of the law, and that, I think, would have cut out a number of wastewater utilities who were land applying biosolids from accessing the grant program. So there's an amendment on that portion and on the proof of financial responsibility. The amendment has not been offered on the bill yet, but I think our understanding is if the bill gets to the assembly floor, that amendment would be offered at that point. So it's all very fluid, but that's kind of where we're sitting on that bill at this moment. And then there was another bill introduced that would create these PFAS management zones. That bill doesn't seem like it's moving quite as much as the other bill, but that one is out there as well. It would provide well compensation funding to people within a PFAS management zone if there was impact to drinking water wells. On the rulemaking side, we are, DNR is moving forward on rulemaking for groundwater, drinking water, and surface water quality standards. And I think is anticipating, so they're holding stakeholder meetings currently on those rules, anticipating, I believe, a fall 2021 date for having rules available for each of those three categories. Just, I guess, a couple of non-PFAS